The Arab slave trade, often overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade, was one of the longest and most extensive systems of human trafficking in history. Spanning over 1,300 years, it involved the enslavement of millions across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Unlike the transatlantic trade, which primarily targeted men for labor, the Arab slave trade placed a significant emphasis on enslaving women and young boys, often for domestic servitude, concubinage, and military service. This vast and brutal network shaped the demographics and cultures of entire regions, yet its history remains relatively underexplored in mainstream discussions. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Arab slave trade was the sheer scale of human suffering. Enslaved individuals were subjected to grueling desert crossings, where many perished due to exhaustion, dehydration, and brutal mistreatment. The infamous trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave routes saw countless African men, women, and children forcefully taken from their homelands and sold in markets across the Middle East, Persia, and even India. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, where enslaved Africans had the potential to form family units and communities, the Arab slave system was far more destructive in this regard. A significant number of male slaves were subjected to castration in order to serve as eunuchs, a practice that resulted in a horrifyingly high mortality rate. The demand for female slaves was another grim reality of this trade. Many were taken as concubines, with some becoming part of harems controlled by wealthy and powerful men. These women were often stripped of their identities and forced to assimilate into their captors' cultures. Unlike the chattel slavery system of the Americas, in which children born to enslaved women also became slaves, many of the offspring of enslaved concubines in the Arab world were absorbed into society, particularly if they bore the children of their masters. However, this did not erase the suffering and exploitation they endured. Despite its enormous impact, the Arab slave trade remains a largely neglected subject in mainstream historical narratives. While the transatlantic trade has been extensively documented and condemned, the enslavement of millions under Islamic and Middle Eastern rule is often downplayed or ignored, partly due to political sensitivities and historical revisionism. Some nations have sought to suppress discussions on this topic, fearing the implications it might have on modern social and racial dynamics. Yet, the scars left by centuries of Arab slavery are still visible in many parts of Africa and the Middle East today, reflected in ongoing racial discrimination, cultural hierarchies, and economic disparities. Understanding the full scope of the Arab slave trade is crucial for an honest and comprehensive study of global history. Slavery, in any form, is a crime against humanity, and its victims deserve recognition, regardless of who the perpetrators were. Shedding light on this horrifying chapter is not about targeting a particular group, but about acknowledging a dark past that still shapes the present. Only by confronting these historical injustices can we truly move towards a future that values human dignity above all else. The Arab slave trade not only spanned centuries, but also had a deep cultural and economic impact on the regions involved. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily focused on agricultural labor, the Arab trade involved a wide range of servitude, from domestic work to military service. The Mamluks, for example, were slave soldiers who eventually rose to power in Egypt and even ruled as a dynasty. This system demonstrated how deeply slavery was embedded in the political and social structures of the Arab world. The process of capturing and transporting enslaved people was as brutal as the conditions they endured after being sold. Many African slaves were captured during violent raids carried out by Arab traders in collaboration with local African rulers. Entire villages were destroyed, families were torn apart, and those who survived the initial attacks faced grueling journeys across the Sahara or through the Indian Ocean trade routes. The mortality rate was staggering, with many perishing before even reaching the markets. The trauma of these experiences did not end with the journey. Those who survived were often subjected to inhumane treatment, including forced conversions to Islam, branding, and relentless physical abuse. The legacy of the Arab slave trade continues to influence societies today. In some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, descendants of African slaves still face discrimination, and discussions about this dark history are often met with denial or avoidance. Yet, the echoes of this trade can be seen in the racial and social hierarchies that persist in these regions. Unlike the West, where slavery was eventually abolished through legislative efforts and social movements, remnants of slavery continued in some Arab countries well into the 20th century, with reports of modern-day slavery still emerging in certain areas. By uncovering and acknowledging the full history of the Arab slave trade, we do justice to the millions who suffered under this system. Addressing historical injustices is not about assigning blame to modern societies, but about recognizing past atrocities to ensure they are never repeated.